Technology really peaked with the baby boomer generation. When I say that, I don't mean that the baby boomers invented all of the best technology. What I mean is essentially they lived in the time period where technology did the least harm relative to all of the benefit that it was doing to people. So a lot of this comes down to the topic of automation. Now, I'm not going to do the played out thing where I'm talking a lot about AI, although AI does kind of feed into this. I'm more talking about on a philosophical level when it comes to the automation of labor, because there are two different types of jobs in this world. I'm not talking about producing goods versus services, and I'm also not talking about blue collar versus white collar. I'm talking about civilizational infrastructure versus something called value production. Those are the terms that I've come up with basically. So, civilizational infrastructure is basically any job that is designed around maintaining systems rather than producing new wealth or generating new income like value production. So, let's start with civilizational infrastructure. So, basically, things like doctors, police officers, anybody that works in government, people who work in the medical field, social workers, soldiers, people who like they're like cloud security engineers, cybersecurity engineers, anybody like people who work on physical infrastructure as well. Anybody who their job is basically designed around maintaining people or maintaining the infrastructure for society, I consider them to be civilizational infrastructure. Because, for example, if a factory shuts down, if a small town, they have like half of the people there, they all work at this factory, right? If that factory shuts down, the town is basically dead after that point. It's just like a ghost town, basically. But if the local clinic shuts down, doctors are important, but if the local clinic shuts down, their economy isn't necessarily like completely like thrown off because they'll struggle for a little bit, but it's easier to adjust from losing an essential service like firefighters or a judge. You can operate without those institutions, but you can't have an economy at all without having factories, farmers, people, basically even people who work in offices. Anybody who provides a valuable service to a business, they would also fall under value production, right? And also people who are like barbers, mechanics, anybody who trades a good or trades a service for their income. Those are people I would consider value producers because they can trade, like a country or a community or a city, they can export those kinds of things. It's very important that value production jobs outnumber civilizational infrastructure jobs because those are what generates income. If you don't have that, you essentially don't have an economy. As important as like lawyers are or as police are, they can never really be the backbone of an economy in the same way that people who do business services or people who work in tech or manufacturing or agriculture, et cetera, they can never really be the backbone of an economy the same way those are. Now, an important distinction between civilizational infrastructure and value production is in how much market share is ideal for them to have. So things like healthcare, education, defense, prisons, utilities, et cetera, et cetera. It's clear to see that some type of monopoly for a lot of those kind of infrastructure things, it's better for there to be a monopoly, whether private or public. When it comes to value production jobs, on the other hand, you really don't want to have a monopoly of any sort or an oligopoly. Anyway, not all value production is equally necessary. Obviously, things like agriculture, manufacturing, essential business services, research and development, developing new hardware or software, the trades, as well as essential low tier services, like things like retail or fast food. Those are, they're very essential, and those kind of jobs, they can be backbone jobs. So they're more necessary. But things that are like way on the other side of the spectrum that are way less necessary, that you don't want your society or your economy to be too focused on producing, are things like entertainment, excessive luxury, and a lot of like bags or those clothes, they all make them in the same factory in China, but then some of them they get shipped off to France or Italy. Then they just stamp made in Italy on it, and then they stamp their like logo, and then maybe they add a zipper. But basically, like 90% of it was made in like China or Vietnam. That's kind of what I'm talking about. Those kind of things, they definitely shouldn't be they definitely shouldn't be the main value production that your economy is making. They should be like a little bit of like seasoning, a little bit of sprinkling on top. Anyway, the speaking of how value production, some is more necessary than others, and in terms of making money, value production is more important than civilizational infrastructure. There's also the topic of how valuable people are, and this kind of relates back to why the baby boomers had peak technology. A lot of it has to do with automation. See, back in those days, when it comes to like automation in factories, that's when they started developing things that mostly augmented labor or just did like repetitive or dangerous like tasks. Things that like CNC machines, CAD software, that was like the beginning of industrial robots. Basically things that that mostly did physical labor. There was automation of like white collar labor as well, but the automation of white collar labor that was much more focused on automation of white collar labor back in the day, unlike now when we have AI, it was mostly things like I said earlier, to augment labor. So basically calculators, early spreadsheets. Eventually they developed how to do emails, they made personal computers, those kind of things. So across both white collar and blue collar value production jobs, automation wasn't en masse, replacing so much of the workforce, as well as automation wasn't focused so much on replacing as much labor as possible. And it also wasn't, automating intellectual work, because intellectual work, that's really what makes people, things like writing code, making art. Now we got all of this, crappy AI art, or writing stories, writing text, doing any kind of intellectual labor, anything that like a big problem with modern like automation, with modern AI and things of that nature, is that so much of it is focused on making human beings less necessary. Now, obviously, like an economy, it can't function without human beings, unless, in some dystopian reality, like some CEO figured out a way that they can always, trade money back and forth through some computer system, right? But I don't really think that's possible. But humans are always necessary. So it's by definition oxymoronic to keep automating like forever and ever and ever. And I want to like talk about something that I call the positive feedback loop of automation, where basically automation directly leads to not just job loss, but also just the population going down in general. So basically this is how it goes. First, like they start automating labor, and then when so much labor has been automated, and it's like how it is now, where you can't like easily transition from agriculture to industry, or like how back in the boomers' day you could transfer from industry, you could go get a college degree, and then you could go into business services. Like now, because of automation, since they can't do that anymore, it creates this positive feedback loop where eventually companies are going to have to start outsourcing labor. How like they started outsourcing engineering to India, or how back in the day they used to outsource, or even until today, they used to outsource manufacturing to China. Basically, that all comes from a positive feedback loop, because unless like a group of people, they really have like within them, like they really like they have like a strong faith or like a strong will, they're going to get demoralized if they just see constantly jobs being replaced by AI. They're going to get so demoralized to the point where people are going to stop having families overall. And if that happens, well, then the economy essentially just played itself, because if nobody is creating more humans, there's no more producers and consumers. So naturally, I have a prediction where basically, it's not an original prediction, by the way, but basically, as long as the population continues to decline in your country, eventually everything is going to get outsourced to another country, because the rich also played themselves. Basically, both the rich and like both the working class as well as the owning class, like both of them kind of play themselves in this situation, because the owner class is getting rid of their potential future customers because people can't pay for things anymore. And the working class is destroying their bargaining power. They're always going to lose out either to another country, or they're going to lose out to automation specifically, because it basically leads to like the death or the destruction of humanity overall. I think the next big breakthrough for humanity, it isn't going to be solving some big problem or inventing some big technology. No. The next big step or big breakthrough for humanity is learning when not to invent something. I hope you enjoyed listening to this video as much as I enjoyed recording it. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I really want my channel to get up to like 500 subscribers so I can start hyping it up, well, not me, you, the viewer, right? So please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, Spontaneous History. And remember, always stay spontaneous.